Today we're going to be graphing cosine x, so cosine of an angle. Now it's very similar to graphing sine. We're going to use the same 5 x values, which is our angle, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, but our y values for the function are different. We're finding the cosine of each of those angles. So cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. And cosine of 3 pi over 2 is back to 0. Then cosine of 2 pi is back to 1. Now the domain. This is a periodic function. It keeps repeating itself. So our domain is going to be all real numbers or -infinity to infinity. What about the range? Well, it's still only going between -1 and 1. The period, how long does it take to repeat itself? Again, 2 pi. Our amplitude, so if I'm going from -1 to 1, my amplitude is 1. The initial height, this one starts at 1. And that's really important. Now, if we were graphing cosine of 3x, my amplitude is still 1. We are not shifted up or down, but this will affect my markers here, this 3x. Remember, what's inside the parentheses does the opposite of what you think. Instead of multiplying the x values, multiplying by 3, we're actually dividing by 3. So I'm going to set 3x equal to each of my core x values. So 3x equals pi over 2. 3x equals pi. 3x equals 3 pi over 2. And 3x equals 2 pi. This is so I can find my markers for 5 placements across here. Now when I divide by 3, my new x value is 0. That's going to be my starting x value. Then if I divide by 3, I get pi over 6, pi over 3. If I divide by 3, I'd get pi over 2. And if I divide by 3, I get 2 pi over 3. So I'm going to mark these 5 places. And I'm going to give myself a little space here and make that be the pi over 6. This would be the pi over 3, pi over 2, and 2 pi over 3. Now, I'm going to mark here as my 1 and here as my -1. Let's go ahead and mark, because I'm going every other spot on my x-axis. Cosine starts at 1. Then it's going to go down to 0, then go down to -1, then back up to 0, and back up to 1. So here's one full cycle of cosine. Notice the difference here is we're starting at 1. Now we know it repeats itself, so it would go back down, then down. This side would make a complete hill there. Then it would go down to -1, back to 0, up to 1, back to 0. Let's look at this next one. Okay, so what all do we have going on? The negative in front reflects over the x-axis, flips it. The 2 affects my amplitude. So my amplitude is 2. Plus 3 moves the graph up 3. So I'd actually have my midline would be at y equals 3. So I'm moving up 3. 1, 2, 3. So here's 3. And I'm going to put a dashed line for the midline. And that's going to be my center point instead of the x-axis. That's my midline. Now I need to find my x values that I would mark on my x-axis. So I'm going to set what's in the parentheses equal to my 5 main x values. whoops, I did, yeah, let's fix that. X plus pi over 2 equals 3 pi over 2, and x plus pi over 2 equals 2 pi. Now, if you remember your transformations, x plus pi over 2 is moving the graph left pi over 2, but by doing it this way, we're going to make sure we have the right values. So when I subtract pi over 2, I get negative pi over 2 for my starting point. Subtract pi over 2, I'm going to get a 0. If I subtract pi over 2 from pi, I get 1/2, so that's pi over 2. Subtract 1 pi over 2 from 3 pi over 2, we get 2 pi over 2, or pi. Subtract 1/2 from 2, I get 3 pi over 2. Notice that everything has really just shifted left by pi over 2. And we only really have to mark those 5 places. So I'm starting at negative pi over 2, and we always start at the top. But on this one, it's flipped. Okay, so here's my midline. We should start 2 above, right? But it's flipped, so I'm going to start 2 below. Once you know where you start, we're just going to follow the pattern. So from here, we've got to go to the midline. Amplitude of 2, so I'm going up 2, back to 0, down 2, back to 0, up 2, back to 0, and the same. So it is periodic, it repeats itself. Here's the function. Notice it's flipped. And here we go. What about this one? Okay, so the 2 here is still moving my graph up 2. That's my new midline. The negative is still going to flip it. And now I'm going to find my new x values. So I need to set that equal to my big 5. So 0, pi over 2, pi, and 2 pi. If I solve for x, I would add pi, then multiply by 2. Add pi. So if I add a whole pi, that'd be 3/2 times 2 would be 3 pi. Add pi, I'm at 2 pi, times 2 is 4 pi. Add pi, I'm now at 5/2, times 2 would be 5 pi. You noticing a pattern? Add pi, I'm at 3 pi, times 2 would be 6 pi. So on this one, I'm counting by pi's. Here, we'll space it out. I like doing the spacing out. Pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, 6 pi. And I'll mark over here too. Now we're up 2 spaces. So up 2, this is my midline. What is my amplitude, by the way? Well, there's no number in front of cosine, so the amplitude is just our basic 1. Normally, let's see, where are we starting at? We're starting at 2 pi. So normally, cosine would start at a maximum. But because it's flipped, it's going to start at a minimum. Then it's going to go back to the center line, then up, then back to the center line and down. And then we're going to reverse it. and we get a wave.